So last week we had a discussion about integers, just kind of like a reminder of the information that you should have already known from 6th grade, what an integer was, what it looks like when you're looking at it on a number line, how to compare integers using our inequality symbols, some of our integer vocabulary, and then also our absolute value, the idea of our absolute value. So again, all of these are going to be located up on Google Classroom so that you can utilize them later. What we did not get a chance to do, or an opportunity to get into, was our properties, talking about the different properties when it comes to things like addition and subtraction. We'll get into multiplication and division tomorrow as well, because there's properties for that. So we have several properties that you have been taught. Maybe you might not have been taught them based off of the vocabulary that they are. So for example, commutative property, sometimes what your teachers may have taught you is that order change. Okay, order change can happen when you are adding numbers or if you are multiplying numbers. But for here, associative property, one of the ways that I tell students that they can easily remember associative property is that the grouping is going to change. So when you say that you are grouped with your friends, you associate yourself with them. When you associate yourself with somebody, you are grouping yourself with them. So it's the same thing here for associative property. The grouping is going to change. So go ahead and write that down. Associative property, the grouping, and I'm going to put grouping in parentheses because that's typically where the change happens. What is inside parentheses is going to be different. The grouping is going to change. So for our example here, we had inside our grouping, we had A plus B, and then outside the grouping, we had plus C. In order to do the associative property, what's on the inside is going to be different. You're going to have one old value and then one new value. So A is no longer on the inside, it's on the outside now. And then B plus C is now going to occur on the inside. So when the grouping changes, that means the order that you are performing your operations will also change. In this first scenario, you had to add A plus B first, and then you would add C to that sum. In this second grouping that we had here, we would have to do B plus C first, find the sum, and then we would add A plus that sum. Okay, so it's just changing the order that you're performing things. So for example here, 4 plus 2 has to be done first, which would give us 6, and then we'd have 6 plus 1, which would give us 7. In the second part, instead of doing 4 plus 2 first, we would do 2 plus 1 first, which would give us 3. And then we could do 4 plus 3, which would still also give us 7. They still come out to the exact same value. That's the important thing about these properties, that it doesn't change the answer. The answer still remains the same. Okay, with commutative property is going to be focusing on changing the order of your numbers. So commutative property, order changes. You don't necessarily have groups. You're just changing the order of the problem. So A plus B is the same thing as B plus A. 4 plus 2 and 2 plus 4 are exactly the same value. They come out to the value of 6. And then we have our additive identity property of 0. Our additive identity property of 0, meaning that it doesn't matter what your number is if you add 0 to it, it's going to give you that number. So A plus 0 or 0 plus A is going to give you A. 0 has no effect on your other number when you are adding. Does 0 have an effect if you're multiplying? Yeah, because if you multiply by 0, you're always going to get what? 0. But with addition, the additive identity property of 0, 0 has no effect on the other value. So you can add as many zeros as you want, it's still going to come out to whatever the original number was. So 4 plus 0 and 0 plus 4, they're going to come out to 4. You could have negative 18 plus 0. It's still going to be negative 18. Okay, then we have our inverses. Additive inverse means that you are going to take a number and its opposite and add them together, and they will equal 0. A number and its opposite, its additive inverse, are always going to combine to equal 0. Remember, we called that what last week? Who remembers? When you take a number and its opposite and combine it together, they create what kind of pair? It's in your notes. Look at your first page. Not absolute value. Oh, maybe I did not write it in yours. I think we discussed it, but we might not have written it. Here, so I want you guys to come over to your first page. Yeah, you're right. I did not write it into your notes, but let's go ahead and write it down. We discussed it, that when you take a number and its opposite and you combine them together, they create what's called 0 pairs. Hence the reason that if you add them together, you're going to get the value 0. So 0 pairs are otherwise stated as additive inverses. So if we take a look at these two numbers that we have located here, so we have a positive 5 and we have a negative 5. When we add that positive 5 and that negative 5 together, it's going to come out to 0. That's what creates what we call a 0 pair. They are additive inverses to each other. Another nice thing about additive inverse is that if you've got a subtraction problem, you can change subtraction into addition and it becomes adding the inverse of that number. So you're adding the opposite of that number. Okay, everybody should have this written down off to the side on your front page. 0 pairs are your additive inverses, your direct opposites. You've got 5 and you've got negative 5. If you add them together, they will equal 0. Okay, so if we take a look back here, again, our additive inverses, if we have A plus negative A, or you could have negative A plus A, it's going to come out to 0. Okay, because they are direct opposites of each other. All right. Now, taking a look here at this problem, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be identifying the different properties that are utilized here. Okay, so I want you to take a moment and I want you to think through what kind of properties do you see? Do you see any commutative properties? Did they break these numbers apart using commutative properties? Did they use anything like associative properties? Anything about additive inverses? Go ahead and take a moment to see if you can identify any of those properties. All right, the first thing that we're noticing for here, we have negative 3 2/5 and we're subtracting 1 3/5. But then we change the operation to an addition and we change this to its inverse. So for here, we're identifying the fact that when you have a subtraction problem, it's exactly the same as adding that inverse of the number. Adding the inverse of that number. So we're going to go ahead and write that step down. So we're going to call this one step 1. And off to the side, I'm going to write down what step 1 is. So step 1, instead of a subtracting, we're going to change it into addition. So subtracting is the same as adding the inverse. That is our rules. When we are dealing with integers, we don't subtract, we add, but we add the opposite. That's probably what you were taught last year. You add the opposite. We call the opposite the inverse. You're adding the inverse. Okay, that's our very first step. Step 2, for step 2, what did you guys notice is happening? We've got these mixed numbers here. Do we have mixed numbers written here anymore? Yes or no? No. What did they do? They pulled those values apart. So they took the whole number portion of your mixed number and separated it from the fraction portion. Now notice when it says it's negative 3 2/5, that whole thing is negative, not just the whole number, but the fraction itself. So when you separate them, you have to indicate that both that whole number and its fraction were also considered to be negatives. What we do is we state that that's the opposite of a sum is the sum of its opposites. The opposite of a sum, because that's essentially what a mixed number is. A mixed number is a sum combining a whole number and a fraction. The opposite of a sum is to take the sum of the opposites. So what we did is we took negative 3 2/5 and we split it up into negative 3 plus negative 2/5. We did the same thing here, negative 1 3/5. We broke it up as a negative 1 and a negative 3/5. And then we have this as an addition problem throughout. Okay? The next process, step 3. What happened here in step 3? Logan? They switched the negative 2/5 and the negative 1, right? They switched the order. What property means that we're going to switch the order, Hassan?
Associative property.
Well, no, not the associative property. We're not changing the associative because it's not. Did the inside of the parentheses change? No. But when we switch the order, what is the order switching only going to be, Logan? Commutative. This is a commutative property. So step 3, we use the commutative property. Okay, so this portion right here became this portion here. Negative 2/5 plus negative 1 became negative 1 plus negative 2/5. Why do you think that they focused on changing those? What do you think the goal was in switching these two center values? Let's take a look. What do you think the purpose was for that? Somebody besides Logan. Jeffrey? Very good. So for here, when we had it before, we had a whole number and a fraction that we're combining together. But now, when we switch it, we've got a whole value and a whole value. I'm not going to say whole number, but because they're integers, they're negatives. But we've got two whole value negatives that we're adding together that are side by side. And we also have two fractions that are side by side that we're combining together. It makes it simpler. You usually want to combine fractions with fractions and whole values with whole values. Okay? From there, we're going to go on to step 4. So for step 4, now we're doing the associative property. What we have here that would have been in parentheses, we're going to go ahead and combine those together. Okay? We're changing what is in here to something different. We're combining these together. So step 4, that's the use of the associative property. Because these are no longer negative 2/5 plus negative 3/5, it now becomes a negative 1. And after that, you're just going to go ahead and finish solving. So step 5, you combine and solve. Step 5 is just to combine and solve. Okay? So what I want you guys to do right now, you are going to go ahead and get into your computers that you should have already logged into. Go to the Google Classroom, and there are the 2 IXL links that you need to click on. Who can remind us again as a class, what is the SMART score that is required 70. What can you do if you want to get extra credit? Go up to an 80. Do I accept anything past an 80? No. Okay, so do not waste your time going past an 80. Okay, you're going to have 10 minutes. 10 minutes to work on that, and then we're going to continue on.